The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 19c. Lincoln and the Union soldiers. His tender solicitude for the boys in blue. Soldiers always welcome at the White House. Pardoning condemned soldiers. Letter to a bereaved mother. The case of Cyrus Pringle. Lincoln's love of soldiers' humor. Visiting the soldiers in the trenches and hospitals. Lincoln at the Soldiers' Rest. Throughout the entire war, President Lincoln was always keenly solicitous for the welfare of the Union soldiers. He knew that upon them everything depended, and he felt bound to them not only by official relations, but by the tenderer ties of human interest and love. In all his proclamations and public utterances he gave the fullest credit to the brave men in the field, and claimed for them the country's thanks and gratitude. His sympathy for the soldiers was as tender as that of a woman, and his tears were ever ready to start at the mention of their hardships, their bravery, their sufferings and losses. Nothing that he could do was left undone to minister to their comfort in field or camp or hospital. His most exacting cares were never permitted to divert his thoughts from them, and his anxious and tender sympathy included all whom they held dear. Said Mr. Riddle, in a speech in Congress in 1863, "Let not the distant mother, who has given up a loved one to fearful death, think that the President does not sympathize with her sorrow, and would not have been glad, oh, how glad, to so shape events as to spare the sacrifices. And let not fathers and mothers and wives anywhere think that as he sees the long blue regiments of brave ones marching away, stepping to the drum beat, he does not contemplate them and feel his responsibility as he thinks how many of them shall go to nameless graves, unmarked save by the down-looking eyes of God's pitying angels." The feeling of the soldiers toward Lincoln was one of filial respect and love. He was not only the President, the Commander-in-Chief of all the armies and navies of the United States, but their good Father Abraham, who loved every man, even the humblest, that wore the Union blue. Of Lincoln's personal relations with the soldiers, enough interesting anecdotes could be collected to fill a volume. He saw much of them in Washington as they marched through that city on their way to the front, or returned on furlough or discharge, or filled the overcrowded hospitals of the capital. Often they called upon him singly or with companions, and he always had for them a word, however brief, of sympathy and cheer. He was always glad to see them at the White House. They were the one class of visitors who seldom came to ask for favors, and never to pester him with advice. It was a real treat for the harried President to escape from the politicians and have a quiet talk with a private soldier. Among the innumerable petitioners for executive clemency or favor, none were so graciously received as those who appeared in behalf of soldiers. It was half a victory to say that the person for whom the favor was desired was a member of the Union army. As he wrote the pardon of a young soldier sentenced to be shot for sleeping while on sentinel duty, the President remarked to a friend standing by, "I could not think of going into eternity with the blood of that poor young man on my hands. It is not to be wondered that a boy raised on a farm, probably in the habit of going to bed at dark, should, when required to watch, fall asleep, and I cannot consent that he be shot for such an act." The youth thus reprieved was afterwards found among the slain on the field of Fredericksburg, with a photograph of Lincoln, on which he had written, "God bless President Lincoln," worn next his heart. Rev. Newman Hall, of London, has repeated in a sermon an anecdote told him by a Union general. "The first week of my command," said the officer, "there were 24 deserters sentenced by court-martial to be shot, and the warrants for their execution were sent to the President to be signed. He refused. I went to Washington and had an interview. I said, 'Mr. President, unless these men are made an example of, the army itself is in danger. Mercy to the few is cruelty to the many.' He replied, 'Mr. General, there are already too many weeping widows in the United States. For God's sake, don't ask me to add to the number, for I won't do it.'" It came to the knowledge of Lincoln that a widow living in Boston, a Mrs. Bixby, had lost 5 sons in the service of their country. Without delay he addressed to the bereaved mother the following touching note: I have been shown on the file of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavements, and leave only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln. A case of unusual interest is that of Cyrus Pringle, a Vermont Quaker who was drafted into the military service in 1863, and refused to serve on the ground that his religion and his conscience would not permit him to bear arms. His story, as recorded in his diary, was given to the world after his death. Atlantic Monthly, February, 1913. In spite of his protests, Pringle was taken South and forced to wear a uniform and carry a gun, though he refused to use it or even to clean it. His obstinacy, as it was supposed to be, caused him much suffering, sometimes even physical punishment, all of which he bore patiently, believing that if he was steadfast in his faith relief would somehow come. It did come, but not until after 5 months of hardship and distress of mind and body, his case, with that of other Quakers, finally reached the President. "I want you to go and tell Stanton," said Lincoln to the gentleman who had presented the case to him, "that it is my wish that all those young men be sent home at once." The gentleman went to Stanton with the message, but Stanton was unwilling to obey it. While they were arguing the matter, the President entered the room. "It is my urgent wish," said he. Stanton yielded, and the unfortunate Quakers were given permission to return to their homes, none too soon to save the life of Pringle, who records in his diary, "Upon my arrival in New York I was seized with delirium, from which I only recovered after many weeks, through the mercy and favor of Him who in all this trial had been our guide and strength and comfort." Anything that savored of the wit and humor of the soldiers was especially relished by Lincoln. Any incident that showed that the boys were mirthful and jolly amidst their privations seemed to commend itself to him. There was a story of a soldier in the Army of the Potomac, carried to the rear of battle with both legs shot off, who, seeing a pie woman hovering about, asked, "Say, old lady, are them pies sewed or pegged?" And there was another one of a soldier at the battle of Chancellorsville, whose regiment, waiting to be called into the fight, was taking coffee. The hero of the story put to his lips a crockery mug which he had carried with infinite care through several campaigns. A stray bullet, just missing the coffee drinker's head, dashed the mug into fragments and left only its handle on his finger. Turning his head in that direction, the soldier angrily growled, "Johnny, you can't do that again." Lincoln, relating these two stories together, said, "It seems as if neither death nor danger could quench the grim humor of the American soldier." A juvenile brigadier from New York, with a small detachment of cavalry, having imprudently gone within the rebel lines near Fairfax Court House, was captured by guerrillas. Upon the fact being reported to Lincoln, he said that he was very sorry to lose the horses. "What do you mean?" inquired his informant. "Why," rejoined the President, "I can make a brigadier any day, but those horses cost the government $125 a head." Lincoln was especially fond of a joke at the expense of some high military or civil dignitary. He was intensely amused by a story told by Secretary Stanton of a trip made by him and General Foster up the Broad River in North Carolina in a tugboat, when, reaching our outposts on the river bank, a Federal picket yelled out, "Who have you got on board that tug?" The severe and dignified answer was, "The Secretary of War and Major General Foster." Instantly the picket roared back, "We've got major generals enough up here. Why don't you bring us some hardtack?" On one occasion, when the enemy were threatening the defenses of Washington, the President made a personal visit to the men in the trenches, for the purpose, as he stated, of encouraging the boys. He walked about among them, telling them to hold their ground, and he would soon give them reinforcements. His presence had a most inspiring effect, and the trenches were held by a few hundred soldiers of the Invalid Corps until the promised help came and the enemy withdrew. On a visit to City Point, Lincoln called upon the head surgeon at that place and said he wished to visit all the hospitals under his charge. The surgeon asked if he knew what he was undertaking. There were 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers at that place, and it would be quite a tax upon his strength to visit all the wards. Lincoln answered with a smile that he guessed he was equal to the task. At any rate he would try, and go as far as he could. He should never probably see the boys again, and he wanted them to know that he appreciated what they had done for their country. Finding it useless to try to dissuade him, the surgeon began his rounds with the President, who walked from bed to bed, extending his hand and saying a few words of sympathy to some, making kind inquiries of others, and welcomed by all with the heartiest cordiality. After some hours the tour of the various hospitals was made, and Lincoln returned with the surgeon to his office. They had scarcely entered, however, when a messenger came saying that one ward had been overlooked, and the boys wanted to see the President. The surgeon, who was thoroughly tired and knew Lincoln must be, tried to dissuade him from going, but the good man said he must go back. The boys would be so disappointed. So he went with the messenger, accompanied by the surgeon, shook hands with the gratified soldiers, and then returned to the office. The surgeon expressed the fear that the President's arm would be lamed with so much handshaking, saying that it certainly must ache. Lincoln smiled, and saying something about his strong muscles, stepped out at the open door, took up a very large heavy axe, which lay there by a log of wood, and chopped vigorously for a few moments, sending the chips flying in all directions, and then, pausing, he extended his right arm to its full length, holding the axe out horizontally, without even its quivering as he held it. Strong men who looked on, men accustomed to manual labor, could not hold the axe in that position for a moment. In summer Lincoln's favorite home was at the Soldiers' Rest, a place a few miles out of Washington, on the Maryland side, where old and disabled soldiers of the regular army found a refuge. It was a lovely spot, situated on a beautifully wooded hill, reached by a winding road, shaded by thick-set branches. On his way there he often passed along lines of ambulances, laden with the suffering victims of a recent battle. A friend who met him on such an occasion says, "When I met the President, his attitude and expression spoke the deepest sadness. He paused, and pointing his hand towards the wounded men, he said, 'Look yonder at those poor fellows. I cannot bear it. This suffering, this loss of life is dreadful.' Recalling a letter he had written years before to a suffering friend, whose grief he had sought to console, I reminded him of the incident, and asked him, 'Do you remember writing to your sorrowing friend these words? "And this too shall pass away. Never fear, victory will come."' 'Yes,' replied he, 'victory will come, but it comes slowly.